So this has to do with the Harriet Tubman on the money. Did you hear that story?
I did hear something, but I don't know who she is.
Okay, she's like a fairly famous person who back during slave times, like basically dedicated her life to breaking slaves away from the South and bringing them north.
Okay,
It
that's
was the
interesting.
so she's famous for doing that. She saved like a ton of slaves. I think it was the called the Underground Railroad,
I've
I
heard of
believe.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically it was just a network of locations where people could go to be protected as they worked their way up north to be free.
hmm
So, wonderful woman. They're going to put her on, I want to say the $10 bill, or no, the $20 bill. They're going to take Andrew Jackson off the $20 bill, who was a president, and put on Harriet Tubman. And
Yeah.
I, I'm not sure. I could just be like, still like racist. I'm not sure. I know this is like a really big thing to
Okay.
talk about, but I'm really curious. Like, Harriet Tubman is kind of like representative of a small portion of a smaller portion of the population for like she did wonderful things for black rights and during the times of slavery and um, but she represents a relatively small portion of the population
Okay.
and wouldn't it be better to put somebody on the money who represents like all people whose ideas were across the board, like all more inclusive. I'm not saying her ideals were bad, but anyway, so I bring this up and I kind of disagree with it, but there's like this really strong push to like um, to I feel it at least, maybe in just my sphere of friends, to
Yeah.
push this um, like since black people had it so difficult and they were slaves and through the generations they've had to rebuild a culture. They lost everything, and not only that, they just the atrocities of it all. Because they went through that, should they be like pushed up,
Hmm.
or should we just decide that all people are equal? But and so the color of your skin wouldn't be relevant anymore. Like, should we feel a sense of duty because of the history?
I mean, I think the ideal situation would be to get to a point where we really are colorblind and, the color of your skin doesn't matter. And to get to a point where, um, we don't have to have like affirmative action in college, and other, organizations that target, for example, charities that target specific minorities. Like, I would hope that we get to a point where that's no longer needed, and the charities that we have would just be helping poor people, for example. Um, but unfortunately, I don't feel like we're there yet. So
I agree with you.
there's a lot that uh, certain minorities are having to deal with that, for example, white people don't have to.
Sure.
You know, there's less of them in, if you take the population proportion, um, you know, if everything was equal, there should be those minorities should be equally represented in leadership position in businesses, in government, in all that. Um, but they're not. In college admission, in so many different aspects of life, and you see that poverty is higher among minorities. The living conditions are worse. All these things. So, in order to at least try to equalize opportunity, we I feel like we still need some of those policies. Now I'm open to debate on which ones are good, which ones are bad, which ones will really help, which ones don't, but I just don't know that we're there yet to where we can say, okay, from this point on, we no longer shall consider race as being a factor in anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would agree with you on pretty much all of that. I guess the question to me is like, should integration be enforced? Should it be, and to what degree? Is that the only way it can be done? Is to like to
Yeah.
bring integration together is to enforce it, and possibly it's the ideal way to do it. Like if you didn't enforce it, would we just stay segregated? I think it's possible that that may be the case. So if maybe we have to have a an intense push in the opposite direction.
Well, I don't know if, I mean, segregation carries so many negative connotations to that word. Um, but it could be that certain minorities feel more comfortable living among their own. And it doesn't have to be based
Sure.
on race. It can be based on many different factors, ethnicity, all these type of things. I mean, I come from another country. I gather with people from my corner of the world. I
Sure.
enjoy that. If they were to live, more of them were to live in some neighborhood, I might consider it a little bit more if I'm moving somewhere. Um, so, but it, where it really would matter to me would be equality of opportunity. Do they have an
Mm,
equal chance in getting college? Are the schools in those neighborhoods just as good? I mean, there's no reason why, you know, schools in areas that are dominated by minorities should be any worse than schools that have predominantly, the majority, whatever that may be, population.
and
And
that generally is the case, isn't it? Like I don't know about Fort Wayne community schools, but it seems to me like from what I hear, which means nothing, like schools that are in primarily black communities are generally are they of poorer quality? Is that the truth?
I mean, it's certainly the kind of the common knowledge out there, that's
Yeah,
what everybody seems to quote unquote know that is the case.
yeah.
Um,
I don't really know for sure if that is the case. I,
yeah,
I'm certainly willing to believe it. It seems quite possible.
sure, sure. And yeah, I would not be surprised if that was the case. But one thing that, in order to be fair, we have to consider is, okay, now let's compare. Let's say we find a school in a in some neighborhood where we have predominantly minority population. Okay, and let's say that those people are a little bit poorer. Maybe their parents were a little bit less educated. Now let's find a similar community where it's kind of a below average income, working class, kind of an equivalent on those terms, and let's see the schools there, are they comparable? So is poverty what's driving it,
Mm.
or is race really the factor, or that the minority category, is that really the factor, or is it race?
Yeah. Well, I certainly wouldn't believe that it would be the actual race, like color of your skin, that would determine that
Right.
type of stuff. Obviously, it's got to be something different. I think in the case of black people, and this is just my personal opinion. Um, I mean, there's a lot. I feel like I'm going to get myself in trouble no matter what I say. But it just seems like in a lot of poverty-stricken areas, there's an over proportion of black people, and
Right. Right.
it seems to me like the reason that could be the case is because of slavery.
Sure. And I mean, it's
Slavery
kind of it's a cause and
totally
effect.
wiped out their culture.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Absolutely. And
I
and
mean,
you
it's
got to
only
look.
been 150 years.
Sure. Yeah.
150 years is not that long.
Not at
Uh,
all.
I
Not
mean,
at
just when
all.
you're talking about the passing down of like values and ways of life, like a lot of that stuff stays within the family. It's passed down through generations, and
Yeah.
that's very possible that because they lost so much of that, it's been
Yeah.
difficult for them to come out of poverty.
How many years was it? Um, and this is, my lack of knowledge about U.S. history will shine here. Um, when were the first slaves brought into the U.S. or on the territory of North America?
I think they've always been here as part of European culture as it came over. Like, I mean, Christopher Columbus came over and took slaves when he got here.
But were they enslaved locals or did they
Enslaved
come
locals.
with Africans?
No, I don't know if he came with Africans. I know he enslaved the locals.
Okay.
So, um, yeah, he enslaved the locals, and from my understanding of it, it just apparently African slaves were probably cheaper,
Mm. Yeah,
and so
probably.
just bought more of them and
Um,
brought them over.
so when did uh like I guess when did settlements in on the territory of the US begin, like approximately plus minus, some years?
Like slave settlements.
No, no, no. Like when did we start building cities? Like when did white people start building cities on
Oh,
the territory here?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Hmm.
I don't know like dates. I know it was difficult for people to come over here and make it.
Right, right. But
um,
was it
that's
in like the 1600s or was it
yeah.
this? It
I
was
believe
in
it
the
was the
1600s.
1600s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so slavery was officially abolished when?
Was it 1864?
18 something. So for about 200, 200 some years, you know, there was slavery here. I was just trying to kind of gauge because we've had it for about 200 years and we haven't had it for like 150, right?
Yeah. Huh.
So, how long does it take to abolish a culture and how long does it take to restore it? And
Jeez.
and when you come from nothing to become equal, to the oppressors kind of thing.
Oh yeah. Well, I bet you could abolish it in a generation. I
Mm.
mean, you just take them out of their environment, make them work. There's no real resources to like teach the young, no time, uh, and you die. I mean, I bet you in a generation you lose culture, you lose a majority of your culture in that type of environment. I'm
Yeah,
just
you very
guessing.
well could.
I
And
don't
they
know how
weren't
many
permitted. They weren't permitted
generations.
to continue their religious practices while they were slaves, right?
I think it varied via the slave
Okay.
holder.
Because that's
There's
one way. I'm just giving that as an example. Back in my home country, we were taken over by the Ottoman Empire, and actually Christianity was one of the reasons why the culture preserved. The locals never really intermarried with the Ottomans. They stayed separate. They went to separate cultural events. The holiday calendars were different. The celebrations were different. Like all that stuff was different. So in that way, the contrast there, just the cultural contrast, um, allowed that to preserve. But even at the worst of oppression that my people suffered at the hands of the Ottomans, I don't think it was as bad as having the shackles on your hands and feet and only be allowed to go to the plantation and back kind of thing. It wasn't that awful. So it allowed some freedom of movement, some freedom of this and that.
yeah.
Uh, but
The stories that I hear of the slavery that went on here in the United States is like it's atrocious.
yeah,
It's like breeding. like breeding for physical qualities even. Um, there's the story of this is probably, I don't know how common this was, but gator bait, where they would use black babies as bait for alligators.
Oh
Um,
my goodness.
uh, I,
Wow.
and I don't think people lived very long in that type of environment where they just had to
No.
work all the time. I mean, just
Wow.
unbelievable atrocities. And it's hard. It disturbs me that we were capable of believing that type of thing.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think we're all that different than we were 400 years ago, at least anatomically.
Well, anatomically we're not, but I think, um, we've gone through kind of an enlightenment period, and a lot of it wasn't, I mean, I just spoke so warm and kindly of Christianity preserving my people's culture, but in this case, I believe religion was actually hindering progress in these matters. There was a lot of people that were, from what I understand, that were using the Bible as a justification for keeping slaves because,
Yeah.
from what I understood, a lot of people were using the Bible as justification for slavery
Mm.
because you know, in some readings, it condones it or at least never uh, outright bans it. Some people use some passage, I believe, from Paul or something like that, was he was telling his friend how he should, um, try to free himself or something along those lines. And, people extend that to, well, this is where Christianity, bans slavery, but I don't think that happened. I think it was, secular morality, secular principles that drove um, the changes necessary to, ban slavery.
Mm.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
I really should.
You probably better know U.S. history. Am I at least on the right track by making these assumptions?
Uh, I wouldn't know enough to say that you're wrong. I mean, I think obviously, I mean, the Bible gets used to justify all sorts of stuff, so it's hard to tell like what the majority of the population was using the Bible to justify it at that
Yeah.
particular time. I think that there were people who were just as into the Bible, were just as religious, who believed the exact opposite as well. That
Oh, of course, of course.
And so it's hard to tell how much that played a role in it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was two sides to the thing. I'm not trying to blame religion entirely for it, but a
Sure,
certain
sure, I gotcha.
percentage, uh, did. I mean, it's the big book of multiple choice. If you read hard enough, long enough, you can probably use it to justify just about anything.
Sure, no,
Uh,
I agree with you on that.
there's, I was, I'm still trying to read through the whole book. Um,
The Bible?
yes, I am, and I have it on
Okay. I don't know if
audiobook.
I
No, go ahead.
I was going to say I don't know if when people tell me that they've read the entire Bible, I don't know if I ever believe them. It is so hard to read some of the books of
It
that
is.
Bible. I mean, it's like genealogy and all this stuff. I mean, maybe you read it, but there's no way you actually paid attention to the whole thing. Like,
Oh
it's
yeah,
just
yeah. Those are
impossible.
two very different things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you just like, yes, scanned through it, reading it, but you didn't retain a darn thing, I don't know. Does that really count as reading something?
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I mean, especially the first few books were just excruciatingly painful. Oh my
Yes.
goodness. Uh, Especially like Exodus, Numbers.
Yes.
Oh,
Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Judges.
oh my goodness. Yeah, those were painful. But
Yeah, those are pain.
eh, but even like Joshua and Judges and like the atrocities that get mentioned so Like just so easily, oh, they just went and exterminated tribe XYZ. Or, oh, I mean, they killed all the men, but they kept the virgins. What's the big deal here? It just mentions it so like it's nothing. Like it's nothing.
I know. I know. It's hilarious.
It doesn't. Whoa. Okay. Okay. We have a crazy person outside. Um, all kinds of noises today that have to be edited.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just talks about those things so easily without, um, without condemning those. I mean, they're indeed commanded by God and required by God. And, I almost wonder if, that isn't used as a justification in some cases, oh, look at all these bad tribes, that
Mm.
God commanded to exterminate. Well, now we get to determine which are the bad ones, and we're with
Mm.
God, and they're without God, so they must be bad, and we should exterminate them.
Huh.
I or mistreat them, or whatever the case may be. I mean, obviously, today we're not exterminating anyone, um, but I wonder if that played a role. That kind of
I imagine it
mentality.
could. I'm always torn whether or not, this is kind of like which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Sure,
Like,
sure, sure.
is the Bible a justification or like a way of, I guess, justifying what they do? They make stories and religions about the things they're going to do anyway. So slavery, I wonder if that's just a part of the human condition sometimes. Like, let's say civilization was lost
Right.
and, there's a mass die out and civilization got terrible. Like, it seems to me like there would be powerful people who came to rise in that situation, probably the most vicious.
Sure.
And they could very well take slaves, and slavery again would become something of a survival mechanism, like the most efficient way of doing something um, that evil or bad people would take advantage of.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I definitely don't think that democracy is somehow natural to the human existence. It probably something more like a monarchy um, would be much more natural. I mean, if you just look at some of the primates, they have the alpha male in the small tribe that just dominates by his sheer force and power. So I think that's probably much more natural, and it just evolved um, with humanity, with the size and everything, into a monarchy, and then eventually just one person, could not hold back millions of people,
yeah,
and they demanded these changes. So we end up with a democracy, but that's where we gotta um, take care of our democracy and make sure that we don't revert back to those kind of things. And that's where that's why I like some of the apocalyptic TV shows where people get dwindled down to these small little tribes, a few people here and there, and there's always like the strong leaders that emerge. And then I don't see those scenarios as being far-fetched.
oh yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, they seem. I can't imagine it going another way, to be honest with you. I mean,
Almost, yeah.
obviously it's dramatized to some extent, but you can put yourself in some weird positions, with some thought experiments, like you haven't eaten in a week and you're watching your kids starve. Like what? Of
You
course
will compromise those values.
yes, you will compromise your values. I often think like the most important thing is the protection of civilization is abundance.
Yeah.
Abundance is what makes it work. And I imagine if abundance were to go away and scarcity was the rule, then civilization would fall back.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Hmm.
It would be. I hope we never have to find out.
Yeah, I hope we never have to find out either.
um, you know, hopefully technology doesn't destroy us, and uh, yeah, we don't
Hopefully,
get.
we don't overpopulate the Earth and destroy it.
Well, the way we're going, we may very well overpopulate it.
Sure
We
does
don't
seem
seem to
like
be
it.
slowing down.
I
Uh,
know.
somebody
Sex just
was
feels too good, man. You gotta
yeah,
find a way to
right.
make sex not feel so good.
And with all these religious institutions, banning contraception and all that, we'll be procreating a lot for a long time.
Yep.
Be fruitful and multiply. Come on.
There's
uh,
a God. It was a parody. Dark Matter 2525.
oh yeah.
He's a YouTube guy. Um, he did like a cartoon about if Adam and Eve or the creation story were like literal. So you
Oh
had be fruitful and multiply, and then he extrapolates that over the course of like 1,000 generations. If they had been fruitful and multiplied, but never taken the apple or the fruit and sinned, so nobody would ever die. People would have lived forever, and they would have been fruitful and multiplied.
oh
And
yeah.
eventually, there would have been, hundreds of billions of people on the earth,
Would
and they
have been
still would be
crowded.
multiplying.
Would have been very, very crowded. I mean, we would have needed a lot of orchards because apparently people back then were vegetarian as well.
It would have been one world. Right. But
So,
anyway, I know that conversation meandered quite a bit, but I
ah,
don't know. I feel like I could potentially be I am a white male.
yeah,
So I guess I am privileged, and I would agree with that. I think I have been privileged. I haven't had to deal with a lot of the crap that underprivileged people have to deal with,
right, right.
but I'm not quite sure how to deal with that privilege.
I mean, yeah, and I don't know what the right answers are, and sometimes, when we are in this position, um, it's hard for us to even realize, like, when did that advantage give us an advantage? Under what would have been different in our lives if simply the color of our skin was different or our accent was different or if we had uh, you know been Buddhists or if we had been some other religion, like how would that have affected our lives?
Dramatically.
Sure, yeah. But I don't know, at least for me it's hard to imagine. I think that I've achieved everything that I have on my own merits. I got the grades that I did in school because of my hard work. I got the jobs because I was the most qualified candidate. But is that really the case? I mean, was there ever uh, a minority candidate that I didn't know about that I got the job and he didn't? You know, it could be the case, and I would never know.
Well, I think it's a much broader too. So I'm assuming this is another one of those generational things. But if you were born a woman 60 years ago, would you still have become an engineer? I mean, you could have, but the likelihood would have been a lot less.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
it just was more difficult, just because the cultural expectations were significantly different on women then too. So that was somewhat suppressive, I guess, of a woman's
Yeah.
ability to do something.
I mean, when you
Well,
think about it, we were oppressing at least half of the population, being women. Then you add all the minorities and all that. I mean, we were well, uh, you know, above half of the people were oppressed in some way, shape, or form. So those things take a long, long time to get worked out and to, reestablish that equal footing.
Well, I don't know if we've ever had that equal footing. Like this is almost an experiment for humankind to achieve.
I mean, that's true. Back in primitive days, women were much weaker in terms of physical strength, and that affected them in many different ways. I mean, they couldn't go and hunt. They couldn't uh, keep up with the men in certain cases. So, it affected life in multiple different ways. And I mean, democracy is not like we seem to be coming around to this, that it's not this natural state. Like the equality is the natural state. It takes work. It takes time. It takes vigilance. All that.
Do you think we can achieve it?
I mean, even if it's not perfect, I think we can get better.
Yeah.
I don't know if anything ever is perfect, but I think we can do better. I think we can do much better.
Yeah, I think we can do better too. Maybe it's you don't throw away the good for the perfect or something like that. Is that the saying?
Yeah. Any progress is better than no progress.
Yeah, agreed. Interesting.
Even in like something that a lot of politicians have recently been talking about has been the equality of pay for women. Women make, even when they're doing the same job, significantly less than men do. Like, I mean, why is that? I can't believe that, my boss would have consciously offered a qualified woman less money than he would have offered me just because I'm a guy and we're all in the guy.
That's the way I think about it too. Like it's so atrocious. Like who the hell still does that?
And yet you look at the
statistics. Is it actually that prevalent out there? Like,
women make like 85 cents to the dollar or something along those lines. Compared to a man, like it's significant, and it varies by job title. But like how does that happen?
How do and these comparisons are made specifically for jobs that are the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, otherwise it would be completely invalid. So it usually is, even for the same job, same skill set, it's still like maybe it's 90 cents to the dollar, but that 10% is still significant. I mean, nobody would go for a 10% pay cut,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's weird. I don't know. That must be a relic of like the misogyny of the 50s or something like that.
Yeah. And I wonder if, I mean, it's a very complex issue. So I don't want to just chalk it down, under racism, which, I mean, women are not a race, but like just some form of discrimination towards women. But I'd definitely be curious to find out, what are all of the factors involved? Is it that when you get hired in a new job, a woman wouldn't negotiate for her salary as much? Like a guy would be like, yeah, but can you do like a little bit better?
Yeah.
But would a woman ask, or how often would she?
Oh yeah.
I wish I knew the answers to all those questions.
Yeah, that's pretty good. It's really a complex issue. Like there's a lot of details that have to be considered, but still, it's still significant enough to like be concerned about.
Yeah, at least investigate further.
Yeah. All right. Christopher's online. I'm going to add him on. Welcome to the show.
The conversation already in progress.
Ah, nice.
Yeah, interesting conversation, but I don't know how to bring Chris into this one.
Yeah, we've been talking about discrimination and slavery and minorities and like how, are we ever going to reach a perfect state where we wouldn't have to consider minorities and like where they wouldn't be facing special challenges in their life, and so those kind of things is what we were talking about.
Yeah, no, it's interesting just from my perspective because if I go substitute at a high school, that's just, I don't know, a normal average high school around here, I have people asking me if I'm French. Some of the students coming up to me and being like, "Mr. Rex, are you French? Like you kind of look French." If I go substitute at a school like over at West Noble, over by Ligonier, then I have people coming up to me and being like, "Are you Spanish?" It's very interesting to see that differential in what ethnicity or culture I look like I'm derived from.
Definitely European.
Have you ever checked your DNA on one of those DNA places?
Yeah, so that's the great thing is that I've actually had my DNA looked at, and
really?
I'm exactly what I was predicted to be, which is a European mutt that primarily consists of Irish, but I also have a lot of German and English in there as well. And the weirdest part is that I'm actually 0.1% Native American, which is kind of bizarre to me.
1/1000?
Yeah, 1/1000 Native American.
They can really figure that out from looking at your DNA.
Yeah.
They can find that you're 1% something.
So the cool part is how they have kind of one of the baselines that they compare everybody to is how much Neanderthal DNA you have, and mine is 2.6%.
Interesting.
Huh.
What's the norm?
The norm is a little lower. I guess I'm a little more Neanderthal than people tend to be. I think the norm is like 2.3 or 2.4%. So
I haven't seen you carry a barbed wire club with you or something.
I leave it at home. I'm D has seen it or has seen it in my room.
Yeah, well, at least like the norm wasn't like 0.1% Neanderthal, and if you found out you were 2.6, I'd be like, oh darn, man, that's 26 times more Neanderthal.
Read, there is some tribe somewhere in Africa where they're significantly more like closer to ancient humans. Like it was kind of some isolated tribe, but they couldn't really do much more testing because the way that DNA was collected, it was very you couldn't identify the exact person that it was taken from for privacy purposes, so they couldn't go back to and talk to those people and figure out exactly if they're all in the same village or not, or do they stay separate from other people, like how has that propagated to where those kind of ancient human genes and not necessarily Neanderthal but more like ancient human genes, how did that get preserved for so long?
Well, that brings up a very good point that I actually am going to be speaking to my students about tomorrow night, as far as some of the ways that we know that people are of one race, of one species, so to speak, and that we're a very, very young species, just because we really don't have much variability among us. And it's to the extent that what we perceive as different races aren't actual things, because the variability between individuals of a single race is about the same variability between races, which is to say that the individuals of every single Asian has the same kind of variability between all of Asians than they do between Asians and Europeans.
Right.
So it's indicative that races aren't a real thing. There's no there are no genes that are unique to one race that aren't present in other races per se.
Right.
So we can't really make those kinds of genetic determinations there. And when we look at genetic variability within each of the perceived races, there is just a little bit of variability, a little bit more variability within the Africans than there are among any other populations. Europeans have much less variability among them than Africans do, indicating that people came from Africa. So
Sure.
we can look at that kind of genetic variability and make that determination.
I mean, you say we're a young species, but our species has done something that no other species before it has, at least that we know of. What made us what we are? Is it a certain part of our consciousness? Is there something truly unique to being a human? Obviously there is, but what is it?
That's a very loaded question.
Is it?
So there are a lot of things that kind of tend to happen. A lot of different changes that happen all together to kind of balance one effect versus the other. You know, obviously you think about humans as having these giant brains, and that's accurate. Our brains are actually 4 times larger than our ape ancestors, which is a phenomenal change. And it's not just that size that changes. There is significant reorganization and restructuring and specialization of different parts of the brain to fit different purposes. As such, you have this interplay between the brain, how it's wired, and the environment, how we interact with the environment, what kinds of behaviors we elicit. And so that brings us to the advanced utilization of tools, using fire to cook our food, advanced use of technology, and basically adapting the environment to our needs. And so all these things kind of interplay together to just cause a snowball effect of intelligence and brain specialization that results in something that is ridiculously good at developing technology and utilizing it.
Now, do we know enough about evolution to say that our evolution has been any different than other species' evolutions? Like, did we accelerate more than others? Or was it just where it happened to happen, like our brain, for instance?
Right. Honestly, the human lineage has been a pretty common tale, really, when you consider the role of all these different subtypes, so to speak, of humans. You know, we one of our ancestors, Homo erectus, that guy was around for, 1.8 million years. And as soon as Homo sapiens evolved 200,000 years ago, within 100,000 years, all of Homo erectus was gone. We outcompeted them. We actually went out and killed or took over their members of those populations, and we were the responsibility for making them extinct.
That's interesting.
So, once Homo sapiens reached the world stage, we made everything else gone, whether it be Homo erectus, whether it be the Neanderthals. All those other populations just didn't have quite the advantages that, I guess, Homo sapiens did.
So men and women like us actually saw the Neanderthal and killed Neanderthal.
Right. So
is that the way it worked?
Yeah, so that's really how evolution works. A lot of people have this misconception regarding evolution, in that it's a single straight line, and in reality it's a tree. You have a lot of different populations of organisms, each undergoing their own individual evolutionary path. So that's exactly what happened with humans. You know, we had all these different populations of humans evolving slightly differently over long periods of time, and then we come to Homo sapiens, which basically ended up migrating out of Africa and taking over the entire planet, whereas previous populations of humans might have made it up into Europe, like with the Neanderthals. But really, Homo sapiens are the ones that ended up winning out.
And I don't know if it was that we just killed them off. It may have been much more subtle than just going to war and wiping out.
Right. And that's what I meant by saying outcompete.
Yeah.
Just being that we were better able to deal with the challenges of the environment. Eventually we end up learning that a nomadic life is not necessarily the best life, and we started being able to settle in one area, starting to plant crops, develop some level of agriculture and domestication of cattle to help us survive via those means as well.
One thing that...
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, V.
I was going to say, there's something really interesting that Neil deGrasse Tyson had said. He was comparing us to primates, and he said that we're only, in terms of DNA, about just over 1% different from our closest relatives, the chimps. And, yet our brains, our abilities are so much different. He was saying, now imagine a further 1% chance what those beings would be like. How much smarter, how much more able, how much, better they'd be at, many different things. It would be mind-boggling to see that.
Yeah, and actually the number that I present to my students is closer to being around 5%.
Okay.
Just because when we truly look at all of the DNA, we do see about a 5% differential. And funny enough, that's actually about the percent difference that we see between all the populations of humans. It's about that 5%. So the 1% figure actually comes from looking at what people typically refer to as the useful part of DNA, the DNA that actually codes for protein. So they basically ignore the junk DNA that a lot of people like to ignore. But funny enough, that junk DNA actually has a lot of information in it. Kind of judges how we regulate the genes and the proteins in the other bits of the DNA. So really, it's about 5%, but still, it's pretty small. It's frustrating to me, just in my classes, as I try to explain that there are 5% differences between us and chimpanzees, but when you consider the differences between all the different breeds of dogs and their closest ancestor, the wolf, you have a DNA discrepancy of about 25%.
Wow.
And nobody really argues that that dogs came from wolves. That's not really a disputed topic. But for some reason, the 5% difference is a hot topic for conversation.
Well, I mean, the percentage of the difference, I mean, how valid is that as a form of measurement in the difference between species? Like, I could imagine we're talking about 1% of the total, but maybe all 1% of that is like focused right in the brain. So maybe the brain is 1,000 times better than what it was before, prior to that 1% increase. I don't know. How do you measure it?
Right. And that's the thing, is that there's only so much information actually carried in the DNA. A fair amount of the information is also carried on the proteins that wrap up the DNA. So when you think of DNA, you typically think of it in chromosomes, which are these highly condensed structures. Well, the proteins that wrap up that DNA into chromosomes have information on them. And that information on those proteins gets transferred down the line, just like your genes do.
Interesting.
So this is a field, a burgeoning field that really only started about 10 or 15 years ago, called epigenetics, which is talking about things that are related to genetics but outside of the genes themselves.
Interesting.
And it basically just deals with gene regulation, because it doesn't really matter if you have a gene to be super smart and a genius if that gene isn't turned on.
Right. I mean, it may be, like I was just thinking, let's take a chimp, for example. Our genes for the make brain genes may be almost identical, but if there's a regulatory gene that says when to start making a brain and when to stop making a brain, and the stop making brain gene stops a lot later, or whatever regulator stops our brain from growing a lot later, that's how you end up with this bigger brain that now you can utilize. It may be that a very, very small mutation results in a much larger brain, and from which point on, you can now start to utilize that brain and develop the intelligence and develop all that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how much do we really know about genetics?
We're getting better.
I mean,
we're getting better.
It's pretty rudimentary, isn't it? I mean,
it's definitely made a lot better through the Human Genome Project, which I believe was completed just a little over 10 years ago, in which they were able to finally nail down at least what all the genes were in humans. So the challenge since then has been figuring out, well, where can we go from here?
Right.
How do we figure out how those genes are regulated, and exactly what all results in all the phenotypic traits that we see on people, how those genes actually have a real world application to what we're actually seeing on people. So that's the challenge now.
Who's the next Einstein is the man or woman who cracks that code.
And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff has been kind of blocked or inhibited in the years since then, just because the way that we can get about this issue is predominantly through studying stem cells. And so for people in countries and organizations that want to inhibit stem cell research, it is kind of counterintuitive to bettering the human condition and figuring out what makes us tick.
Yeah. It's exciting.
Yeah.
You're one of the most scientifically oriented people that I know, from what little I know about you. What do you think of the human animal?
For one, we are animals, and I struggle with that every single day.
How so?
Just as my wife has to sometimes remind me that I get emotional sometimes, and I get angry, I get defensive, and I just sometimes need her to remind me to take a moment to use my highly evolved prefrontal cortex as being part of a human being, and to calm down and to think about a situation logically, and analyze my reasons for being angry. So it's a challenge for me, much less to try to sit here and take the high ground and tell people to try to take a moment to stop and think before they act. So it's an adventure. I'll say that much.
So you're striving to become a Vulcan.
I really am. I always have, to be honest. During my elementary years, if you would look at the school pictures of me, actually all the way through high school, if I remember correctly, my haircut was that of Spock from the original series. So I had this sleek black hair. I had these bangs that came down to about here. The rest of my hair was cut really short. And in fact, my high school picture even had an Enterprise in the background of it, my senior picture. So yeah, it's
awesome, man.
It's played a role.
I want to see that picture so bad. You had a Star Trek Enterprise behind you.
Yep, I had a lightsaber
awesome,
in my hand. I had a lightsaber in my hand and an Enterprise in the back. I had my snake wrapped around my neck. Yeah.
Wait, you're crossing the shows there with the lightsaber.
Yep, you're right.
Some people would be really upset at you.
No,
oh my gosh. Yeah, but you know what picture you're going to remember for the rest of your life? You're going to remember that one. That's the one you want to frame. That's classic. That's awesome.
You know,
I'm like you in a lot of ways, though. I'm fascinated by my animal part of me. I find it really amusing to watch myself like bounce around from hormonal changes or whatever the hell's going on in me, and then to have to reason it out. And it's so hard sometimes. It is so hard to overpower that stuff sometimes. Like I think about it in terms of eating. Man, it is so when you're hungry and you don't need to eat, you know you shouldn't eat, but you're gonna eat. Like, and it just totally overpowers the reason part of your brain. And I often wonder, like, how many things that I am are exactly that. Just this overpowering urge to do stuff. And then I have this little flickering light of consciousness of reason that I try to foster and take over more of my mind, but it's difficult. But I've gotten better at it, and I've learned to try to enjoy the parts of my animal nature, if you want to call it that, that are good and have good things, because it definitely has a lot of good things to offer. But then to try to get rid of the ones that are not good. So
Yeah.
It's been fun and hard and frustrating.
Yeah, I definitely get pretty hangry myself, so to speak. That's definitely something I struggle with, just because my brain literally wants to shut down if
Did
I
you
don't
say
have
hangry?
anything in it.
Hangry.
Hangry, yes. Hangry while I'm hungry. Yes, the
That's
hangry
awesome.
stage.
That
Yeah.
word actually describes the feeling very well.
Yeah. I can't claim credit. I didn't develop that word, but it's pretty genius. Yeah.
I'm going to use it. My wife will be calling me hangry all the time.
you know, if to kind of bring back the conversation to the main topic that we had, you know, if
Please.
not that this is bad as we're talking about right now, but I kind of been wanting to sneak that in for a while now. um, you know, uh, I was going to bring up Ronald Reagan. I believe he said that. You know, back then they were talking about uh, these weapons in space, and you know, aliens were very popular, and this kind of thing. And one of the things that I believe he said was how quickly the human race, I believe he said, would unite if we were faced with like an extraterrestrial challenge. Now
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely paraphrasing here, um, but I don't know. Do you guys think that there's merit to such suggestion?
I do. I mean, we wouldn't just get rid of all of our difference all of a sudden, but it would be something that would unite us for the first time as a world. And, but I think we're doing that to some extent already.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and Secular Fort Wayne on Meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.
Paraphrase.